All right. This video looks at employee discrimination as an alternative to the employer discrimination of. So there's still taste for discrimination, but the source is coming from the employees. So basically, the idea is if the employees don't want to work with a certain group, then they would require higher wages to work with them. Is the basic idea. So basically, it's like this. So the wage required to work with the dislike group is we can call it W prime, and this is just going to be well the base wage plus this discrimination coefficient, right? So they want to be compensated. So this part right here is they want to be compensated for having to work with a group that they don't like. Um, oops. So they want to be compensated. That's the idea. And so then the same idea goes here. Yeah, the bigger this D subscript E is, the more discriminatory their preferences are. So if this is really big, then they have a really strong discriminatory preference. And if it's small, then they have a slight discriminatory preference. That's the basic idea. So this discriminate, we'll call them the discriminating group. They have to be paid a higher wage if they're going to work with the dislike group, and they would work for W, just the plain W, this one. Um, if they didn't have to work with the dislike group, right? So this gives you the basic idea of this model. Um, so if there's many, so let's imagine if it's a racial discrimination, just to make an example, you could also do it for gender or some other ethnic prejudice. So if many white workers are prejudiced towards black workers, that means that many of them have a discriminatory coefficient greater than 0. What do you predict the firms would do? So maybe take a second to pause before we go on and think about it. So basic prediction is, well, if many employees, sorry, have this discriminatory preference, then employers may run segregated businesses, even if the employer themselves doesn't share this prejudice, but they might do it because it'll be cheaper or save them money in some way. So they basically don't want to pay the majority group the extra wage, so they might segregate them. So they might segregate them by place, so that they're running segregated operations in different locations, or it might affect them that way. Now, if the group who is being discriminated against is quite large, the firms will likely still have to hire them. So if they're relatively small, we would expect this to result in very extreme segregation. Okay, so this is again theoretically. We won't necessarily see it exactly like this in the real world, but theoretically, if the group is relatively small, then you would just expect the firms would never hire them to work in an integrated workplace, but they might hire them to work in some specialized center that is very segregated. But it wouldn't necessarily result in a wage gap in that sense. Now, if the discriminated group is relatively large, then the firms may still hire them because they're a relatively large part of the labor, but they'll pay them less, or meaning they'll be paying the group that has the discriminatory preferences more as compensation. Okay, so this is one possibility. Now, some people might think this is not very realistic, that needing to be paid more to work with a group of people you don't like, or that you have a negative perception of. And so let's think of some other ways to set this up that might be maybe more realistic. Okay, so one idea is, well, the dominant group doesn't want to work in the same occupation, but they don't mind working in the same firm. So this could be people have discriminatory ideas about uh, specific roles. For example, this could be about gender roles, or this could also be about race, right? So they have workers have particular ideas about roles, and they want to maybe protect their role from competition, but at the same time, they don't want to be in the same role as the group of people that they have these negative opinions of. Okay, so in that case, you might find the firms may be somewhat integrated, meaning you're going to find a diverse group of people working in the firm, but the occupations themselves will be quite segregated. Okay, so you might find mostly men working in certain occupations and almost all women working in another occupation, or you might find racial segregation amongst occupations. So this is the prediction of that setup. Um, another prediction that goes along with this same thing was the dominant group, they don't mind to work with a minority group, or for example, with women, but they maybe don't want to be supervised by them. So they have a negative perception, but their negative perception is not just general. It applies in this specific situation. Okay, so if this is true, then that would create some kind of glass ceiling for the group that is being discriminated against, because the firms may not want to promote them to supervisory positions, because it would have a reaction, a negative reaction from the dominant group has these discriminatory preferences. Right. There might be some evidence for employee discrimination in the blue collar jobs, some direct evidence. Okay. There's lots of anecdotal and case by case evidence of employee to employee discrimination in things like factory jobs and work sites and truck drivers and this kind of thing. There's quite a lot of anecdotal evidence of this kind of discrimination that's employee to employee. And there's also some evidence in research about people having preferences about who they're supervised by as well, possibly influencing the glass ceiling. We'll come to that next week. Finally, one last setup is just so again, this is not through the wage, which was how the theory originally came up, but it's another way to think of it. But still, the key idea is that the employee, the worker, is the source of the discriminatory preferences. So if workers have these discriminatory preferences, it may not actually affect wages, and it may possibly not affect hiring decisions if the firms are under fair hiring practices type of legislation, but it could limit people's access to on-the-job training. Okay, so in many jobs, there's a lot of information sharing from older workers and more experienced workers to newer workers. And if the dominant group that has discriminatory preferences is kind of the established group in this profession, if they have a negative perception of the new entrants, either status, either gender or race or something like this, then one way is kind of a passive aggressive approach of maybe not doing direct things to discriminate against them, but they can kind of freeze them out by not giving them as much transfer of skills and knowledge as they would somebody who's from their same group, right? So this could hinder the skill development in this new group and make it harder for them to be productive. The final one is, again, not through the wage, but through some other kind of mechanism is, well, it could affect productivity through the effect on teamwork and staff morale. So again, if you have many workers are prejudiced and have a strong discriminatory feeling towards a minority group or towards women, the employer might be reluctant to hire from that group because of this worry. There was So this is not, again, not through the wage, but it's through some kind of direct conflict kind of thing, or an indirect conflict on the terms of teamwork and this sort of thing. And there's evidence, especially in the past, there's evidence that this was definitely a situation. For example, in some jobs that may be reluctant to hire minorities, again because they feel that there will be pushback from their existing employees.